Good evening and welcome to the SLA Europe Webinar, COVID-19 and its impact on business research requirements and forecasts. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Ben Longman. Ben is the founder of Type Talk, a specialist research provider focused on retail and distribution in Africa. And before this, he ran divisions for Data Monitor and became the managing director of Informer's consumer portfolio. But over a beer, most people like to ask him about his 2001 sabbatical spent exploring Australia in an unreliable 4x4 and how he safely crossed a crocodile-infested river. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, it's crossing crocodile-infested rivers has set me up well for conducting research in Africa, and I dare say might set me up well for talking about the pandemic. Today I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the key themes to do with how research companies are reacting to COVID-19, both now and what it kind of means for them through the next 12 months, and take you through just what's gone on. So taking us back in history a little bit, there we go. It probably seems like a decade ago, but this is what the World Health Organization was putting out in January. No clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. And it's a nice reminder that this is a really fast-moving event. The pandemic itself has seen people revise all sorts of theories. What's the best way to deal with it? What's the data? Everyone's suddenly become an expert. But actually, the response to this will also be fairly challenging in terms of what data to use, what assumptions to base it on, and so on. So here we go. That was January, and it feels like a decade ago. Just see if I can. What we also found, pretty much as soon as the pandemic started, was that everybody put out an email, messaging, and so forth, and bombarded people with information. And a lot of that information wasn't really all that interesting. And you will have received the same things. You will have received 101 emails from people that you never realized you were on a mailing list for, all telling you how they were dealing with the pandemic. And that's tailed off a little bit now, but still, I guess the key message that comes out of that is, there's a lot of information flying around, and not all of it is great information. And, on the social media front, organizations like Twitter and Facebook are having to deal with a lot of misinformation. But even when we look at good faith interactions, you're just seeing a lot of people pumping out messaging and information about what it means. And frankly, it's overwhelming. And so that's the first scenario, really, that research companies fit into a universe where everyone's pumping out information. We're now at the point where I think that information has started to tail off a bit, and coincidentally, the UK's talking now about stopping its information briefings. We've reached a point of saturation, and we've also reached a point where, a lot of what has been said, has been said many times. So one of the phrases that came up while this was all going on is nowcasting. Nowcasting is hard. Nowcasting is a weather term, and it is about forecasting in real time about what's going on. And forecasting in real time is, for an analyst firm, is quite an exciting thing, but it's also quite a frightening thing. Senior people within analyst firms all tell themselves that they're amazing at doing nowcasting and forecasting, and some of them are and some of them aren't. And as we saw with Dominic Cummings, there's an awful lot of ego in here where people go back and revise what they said and pretend that they said something different. But the reality is that, at least for the early part of this pandemic, that there was an awful lot of bullshit. And nowcasting is a very generous term for what's been going on. So really through March and April, nowcasting, very little real data to pull upon, very little clear, unambiguous anchors of information for which to sort of forecast what's going on. And really, we're still in the nowcasting stage, although it feels like we've gone over the curve and COVID-19 may be something that, at least from a sort of stressful, what's it all about perspective, that it's something in our past. It's not in our past. When you look at the economic data that's being released, it's going up to the end of March. So we still don't really know what the pandemic has done at an industrial level. We don't really know what the impact is. The data that we have currently, for example, from the IMF, suggests that the global economy will shrink. We know that certain sectors like hospitality have really struggled because they've closed. Other sectors, will do better. Bicycles are up. Hamburgers are down. That kind of thing. But we're still in this nowcasting phase. We're still in the phase where, frankly, people are going to be surprised by some of the data, that markets will move on the back of it. And a good indication of that is things like oil prices, where oil prices are still, quite volatile, really. And there's still a lot of chaos and disruption in the market. So that's where we were. And analyst firms, of course, and research firms sitting squarely in the middle of this. They're doing their nowcasting. Okay, they say that they're doing their forecasting and their analysis, but they're having to adjust, and that's a discipline that some of them have had to learn on the fly. Normally you have the luxury of planning a schedule and talking about things, and and working within known parameters. Company releases a bad set of results, the crop fails, whatever it might be. But this is a situation which is really, where you've got this huge pandemic, and where you've got an economic fallout that's about as bad as it's been since the Great Depression. So everyone's nowcasting. And in fact, this is what the Financial Times said back in March or April. They said banks are forecasting on gut instinct, just like the rest of us. And that's something really that only the FT can admit to. But if you were to go into the banks, I think you would find an awful lot of people using euphemisms for gut instinct, drawing on their many years of experience, making judgment calls and so on. And I remember once horrifying a colleague of mine, referring to gut instinct, in this way. But broadly speaking, in the absence of data, that's what people have had to draw on. Okay, and again, the FT's really nailed this. We will discover the quality of pre-crisis underwriting in the months to come. We will discover the quality of mid-crisis forecasting in the months to come. And actually, people have had a lot of time to think about this. So, an awful lot of executives have had to stop traveling. They've had a lot of time at home. They've saved time by not commuting. Our experience with our client base is that that many of them have used that time to sit down and work through some big, thorny strategic issues that perhaps they wouldn't have had the time to do in a normal year. So actually, we're really going to judge the quality of forecasting within client companies, but also within the research firms. So the research firms broadly have had to shift their focus in three ways, I think. The first way is they've had to produce all sorts of things that react and respond to what is going on. And, the better firms produced COVID-19 hubs, landing pages, and so on. And in that, they started to aggregate all of their stuff. This is what's going on. This is what we're seeing. This is, the news that's coming out, and so on. And this is our response. And I think, we're still a little bit in that phase, and we'll still keep being in that phase until probably another set of economic data comes out. But we're starting to move to this phase two. Again, the better firms talking about, what is the change going to be? What does it mean? What are you going to have to do as a company to adapt to this new scenario? And again, we're back here in slightly unfamiliar territory, where people are going to have to forecast what they already think the impact of COVID-19 is down at whatever level they're forecasting at, and prepare for the change. And we've got this terrible phrase that everyone's talking about, the new normal. So if you've heard this phrase, to death, you've probably become immune to what it means. What is the new normal? Well, in that, people are making very bold predictions that, a little bit like, we're all getting in flying cars. We're all going to sit at home, we're all going to be working from Zoom, we're all going to be doing this, we're all going to be doing that. You know, people aren't going to hug anymore, they're not going to go out and do these things. And you know, some of these predictions are right, and some of these predictions are wrong, and some of these predictions are right for the wrong reasons, and some of these predictions will be wrong for the right reasons. And that's where we are in terms of what the research firms are doing. They are trying to establish what the winning strategies are for the businesses that they serve. I think that's a very challenging exercise for them. And as a client of a research firm, I guess one of the things that I would be asking is, can you show your workings? Actually, the end result of the analysis to some degree is less interesting than the workings that have taken you there. Okay, so it's actually very interesting to know what assumptions people are using, and I think it's a very good test of an analyst firm, not only that they can show their assumptions, but also that they can share their assumptions, because that's really what you've got to pull into your workflows. If you're using their analysis, you want to be able to pull in their data as well as their analysis and test that as well. So those are the first two phases, and it's been a big disruptive change of focus for research firms, particularly this react and respond thing. It's very exciting. Set up your COVID-19 hub, everyone's running around, you know, lots of demand from clients for answers, and then suddenly, you know, you get to produce big analyses about what it all means. And it's, you know, it's the stuff that analysts dream of, to be able to talk about change and for people to come and ask them what they think. But you know, the warning is that you know, change often doesn't happen the way we think it does, and I think it's important to go and look at the methodology as much as the output. For the research firms as well, the one thing that they'll be talking a little bit less about is that all of this react and respond and producing information on the outcomes and the future in a COVID-19 world also has an impact on their existing production schedules. So, you know, while everyone's running around trying to make sense of COVID-19, and while they've had all sorts of challenges in their personal life, kids at home, you know, not being able to go and do things, queuing at supermarkets and so on, probably one of the things that's been buried in that message is actually, you know, what are the research firms going to produce this year? Because if you've signed up to a particular program, and you know, the research firms have spent, you know, a lot of time covering COVID-19 in a different way, you know, something's got to give in this. So I guess one of the questions, if you're signed up to you know, to a service that's done a really good job of producing analysis of COVID-19, one of the questions you might want to ask is, okay, well, you know, how does that affect your existing schedule through to the year? What's been the cost of that for you? You know, and what does that mean in terms of what we're going to get and what we're not going to get? Let's just have a. So the other thing the analyst firms have had to deal with, I've made brief mention of it, is that for certainly the months of February, March, April, and I think in May too, you know, huge amounts of demand and engagement. Okay, so research firms going out and trying to pull as much information in, but a lot of clients as well coming to the research firms and saying, oh, what do you think about this? Do you have any information on this? Can I have some information on this topic? Because everyone's wanted answers. So when I've spoken to other organizations about what they've seen huge spikes in terms of sort of demand for their information, lots of downloads, lots of analyst engagement, lots of, you know, just lots of drawing on these resources, and again, a very exciting time for them, but also for the analyst firms, perhaps a little bit overwhelming in some ways as well, you know, very distracting, very disruptive, if they're not really set up for that level of engagement. Again, you know, it has an impact. I think normally when we talk about analyst firms, we hold in our mind maybe someone like Gartner, which is very well set up for this because it's built around, a very high engagement model. But at the other end of the coin, you've got a lot of companies that, that really turn the handle and churn out information and aren't as well set up for demand and engagement. And it's those companies, I suspect, that may find this period a little bit more challenging. But very, very useful for research firms to have this engagement. It's raw information, it's client interaction, and to some degree, when we step back and look at these levels of engagement, when you as clients perhaps look at the levels of engagement you've had with analysts, it's a very good way of judging who's got useful information and who's reactive. I'm just going to see if we can jump a slide. The other thing that I guess has come out is who's the best in class information provider, and I've used an example here that emerged very early on in the COVID crisis, which was at the FT. It did something very simple. It's one graph. It plotted countries against one another in a comparative way, and it said, look, how many people are dying, and what's the sort of general curve of this? We were all talking about curves, weren't we? Even up to sort of a few days ago. And I think it's a really good example for research firms to take stock of, and if you use research, that sometimes less is more. Okay, sometimes you just keep coming back to one piece of information that's being updated, and that is worth more than a whole bunch of words, a whole bunch of analysis, and so on. And I would say that's a really useful lesson to come out of this on all sides, that taking the time to produce a clean, reliable, understandable piece of information that allows people to take the information and digest it instantly is extremely high value. Before this crisis, if we'd said, would you be spending your time looking at this one graph that did this one thing, you probably would have said, no, I don't think so. This is a very rich and complex and dynamic thing. But actually, this is what we spent our time doing. We've gone to the Financial Times, okay, and John Byrne Murdoch has done an absolutely cracking job of doing this. And so the question is, where are the other John Byrne Murdochs? Who else has done a job, this well at helping, gather information together and make sense of it? The other thing that's come out in relation to analyst firms is that perhaps they haven't necessarily held all the premium data. In fact, while this crisis was unfolding, really some of the best sources of information were coming out of people that weren't typically information companies. They were people like Google, who had fascinating information in terms of what people's mobility were. Similarly for Transport for London and Uber, mobile phone companies have very useful information in terms of where people have been moving, what kind of activities they've been doing. The banks know where people have been spending. The electricity companies know what the impact has been in terms of demand coming from the industrial sector and so on. And this is the classic thing that hedge funds want to get their hands on. They want to get their hands on data that has limited value in one arena and very high value in another. But what it's also shown is that that perhaps some of the analyst firms out there have relied a little bit too much on predictable cycles of information. I will produce an annual update to my information. I will do a data gathering exercise and then I will produce it out here. And in fact, I think for some time we've seen that there are some very interesting digital startups out there doing things with more real-time information. And I'm going to use an example of one, a company that we do a little bit of work with. There's a company called Caribou Data that takes packets of information from people's mobile phones with their permission, and it uses it to understand sort of aspects of people's mobility and spending. That data, left untracked, has very little value. It's just a sort of byproduct really of people using their mobile phones and using mobile money systems. But it's actually very valuable in terms of shedding light on what people are doing at a particular point in time. And there's a whole range of companies out there now starting to leverage information that's this sort of byproduct, or starting to gain information in byproducts of other services. So the front screens of mobile phones, for example, another place. And I think it's something for information buyers to think about as a test. Okay, is your information provider getting information in a dynamic and exciting way? If it's not, and you think they should be, then think about where those sources of information might be coming from. What we've known from COVID-19 is by far and away some of the most interesting information was coming out of hospitals, mobile phone providers, and search engines. And Google's made a big deal about this for a long time, in terms of things like sort of Google Trends and searching, and it's fascinating and it's revolutionizing consumer insight. But I think that the information industry has been quite slow to react to that, and it's traditionally tried to sort of build its own assets and guard them in its own way, without necessarily realizing that, you know, the amount of time that we spend on our phones, that's all data generation, that's all insight generation. The other thing that we've seen come out from the analyst firms is that that they've been asked to provide reassurance. So reassurance in this context, where there's no real information coming out of sort of organized sources, reassurance is what's everyone else doing? And there's a really nice example here from Gartner where they've gone out to CFOs and they've taken the pulse very quickly about what challenges people are facing, what sort of actions they're taking, and what their perspective is on the response. And I think that's a really nice example of a research firm having customer intimacy. Okay, it's a good test actually, COVID-19. How intimate is the firm with its customers? How easy is it for it to go out and say, look, we've got questions for you, and be taken seriously? And I think this has divided up the universe into people that can do that, and who have that relationship with their customers, and people who have more of a transactional relationship and their customers, you know, just draw down on sort of on information. They don't really share anything, and the value of that interaction is left untouched. So a nice example of that. People have sought reassurance. They really have, you know, particularly in areas like finance, particularly for people that have had to create responses on the fly. They've needed analyst firms to do that aggregation job. The other thing that we've seen is that that people have been much more willing to share information. So really consistent theme coming out from analyst firms, which is that when they've gone out to talk to their clients have shared a lot more. And I think partly that's to do with people sitting at home. It's a very intimate environment. It's very easy to say, well, you know, our trading's badly hit, or, you know, this is what we're having to do, or we're considering, you know, laying off 20% of our staff, whatever those factors are. We found it with all of our customers. When we've talked to them, we found that they have shared, you know, quite a lot of information about what's going on, what their thinking is, what they're trying to do, and how they're reacting. I think the question though is, are the research firms listening? So are they listening and understanding about how they should be reacting? And I'm not sure they are. And I think it's a useful test if you're an information buyer to ask that question to analyst firms. You know, what are you doing with this information, and how are you adapting, and what lessons have you learned? How are you changing? Anecdotally, we've heard from various people that, you know, that they are a little bit frustrated that the research firms aren't listening as much as they should do, and to some degree that's because it's been hard for analysts to shift from I'm going to tell you about COVID-19 and share all my thoughts to listening. You tell us what's going on with you. You tell us what you need to know. You tell us what we should be doing to help you. So that's an interesting scenario again, and a very useful test for whether a firm is reactive, whether it genuinely listens, and whether it's got the flexibility to respond. Clients, without question, have been willing to share. Research firms, some have made a good job of listening, perhaps some less so. The other thing that's really come out strongly is that it's a great time to innovate. It's a great time to do lots of things, actually, when business tanks this badly, when we know that there's going to be effectively a global depression. So the IMF is forecasting that that globally the economy will shrink by about 3% in 2020, and that's about 6 percentage points down on what would have happened. In some cases, that's going to be a very short-term, very unpleasant shock, and in fact, the economies will start to bounce back in 2021. But you know, if you run a business, that's cash flow. It's cash flow pressure, really. And in amongst all of this, it's an absolutely great time to innovate. We see this outside research firms, of course. You know, all these restaurants that have had to re-establish themselves as fast food places or community shops or whatever it might be. All these new businesses that you know, that have sprung up, suddenly producing hand sanitizer. You know, all of these organisations that have had to sort of think about their proposition, knowing that it's not going to be the same for a wee while. But in research firms, it's still a great time to innovate. All of this disruption going on. What should they be doing? And the answer is they should be learning the lessons from this about really what their clients value in them, and what services there are that, you know, that they should be delivering and what they shouldn't be delivering. To some extent, clients are the problem here. So the client is always right, except when the client's wrong. And the clients are the problem here sometimes, because if you are a research director within a firm and you go out to your clients and you say, guys, what should we do next year? Your clients will come back with a great load of feedback, but very rarely will they say to you in unison, you should stop doing this thing over here and you should start doing more of this thing over here. So often you've got legacy clients that are very wedded to some of your older bits of sort of way of doing things, and you've got other clients that insist that unless you do something different, then, you know, they're not going to give you more money. But in all of this disruption, it's a fantastic time to innovate, okay? Because the clients' needs are changing, because you probably have to change anyway, and because you had all these great learnings. So the good examples have been sort of new webinars, you know, building information around landing pages, having to produce data and get it to market much more quickly. That's what we mean, you know, when we talk about innovation. But also it's about being able to bury some things and activate others while all of this change is going on. And I would stress here that, you know, the analyst firms are going to have to innovate whether they like it or not. Okay, they are going to feel considerable pain from clients not renewing, or renewing at lower values, and also not signing up in the first place. So their new business is going to feel affected, their renewals are going to be affected, they're not going to have as much money as they planned, and they're going to have to cut headcount and think about this. So the last time the analyst firms really did this in earnest was probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more for some, when they went from print to digital, and then, you know, again when they went from digital to sort of digital and interactive, and now, you know, we're looking at a new phase for analyst firms where they, you know, where they can use all of these different tools, data tools, where they can push information out on social media, where they can be much more intimate with their clients through tools like webinars and Zoom, and so on, and peer-to-peer groups, and, you know, all of these other things. So this is what the slide says. Who led the digital transformation in your company? We can ask that for any company, but you know, the answer is COVID-19. COVID-19 is a fantastic catalyst to innovate, and you should be asking your research providers, how are they innovating on the back of this and listening to what they say? I would expect them to be innovating now. Some are, absolutely. Some won't. Let me just, we lost a slide. That's it. So the visible pain points. Oh, my apologies. I'm trying to juggle slides here. Okay, so the visible pain points for the research firms are that the money that they were making, then they're not going to make in 2020. So, client spend will go down. And I think when we go out and talk to our clients, when we talk to our peers, the one thing that everyone says to us is, look, we're guarding cash and budgets are tighter, and we've got to look at ways to cut our spending. And actually, that's a very liberating thing. If you're an information buyer, this is a very liberating thing to do. And I would urge you, put your money into the research firms that you value. Okay, they will need your support. They will not come out with a begging bowl and say to you, our cash flow has been hit badly by this, but it will be. Okay, and if you value a company, give them your money. The flip side is true. If you don't value an organization's research, don't give them your money. Do not give them your money. Okay, this is a great time to shed people in the industry that are producing generic information that is of minimal value to you. Okay, so client spend is going down, and that's a visible thing. We all know it's going to happen. Okay, and it's going to hurt now, and it's going to hurt through the rest of the year. Particularly firms that have events, they're not doing events. I mean, that's it. So they're doing a little bit of virtual events. They're struggling really to find a way to monetize that. They're struggling to convince customers that they should pay the same sort of money that they would have paid to go to a conference or expo in Dubai and do it virtually. So those events revenues are down. Ad revenues down. No one's really interested in looking at ads right now. So the ad revenues are down, and the new business is down as well. Okay, so you ring up a client and you say, look, do you want to buy this stuff? We haven't done business before. And the client says, look, now is not the time to be bringing on a new company and working with them. So, to put that into context, if you're a research firm, you are doing well if you have a renewal rate of 90%. Okay, so you're doing well. Okay, but that means that roughly 10% of your revenues, okay, need to come from your new business. You're doing still okay if you've got a renewal rate above 80%. Okay, so 20% of your revenues coming from new business, and you're still not doing badly if you've got a renewal rate of 70%, so 30% of your business coming from new business. There are firms out there that have renewal rates of kind of 50%. So 50% of their revenues they have to get from new clients, and those businesses are going to find it very hard. Okay, businesses at the 70% mark are also going to find it hard. Businesses at the 90% mark are going to find it a lot easier, provided they can sustain those renewal rates. But this is what we mean by the pain points. Okay, it's about that relationship between cash flow, new business, and survivability. Here we go. So the hidden pain points that they're not going to tell you about are that when you have a revenue crisis within a research firm, if it's a subscription-based revenue, you don't feel the pain immediately. You feel the pain down the line. Okay, so if you think about your subscription revenues, in effect, they're 12th across the year. So in month 1, you'll feel a 12th of the pain. In month 2, a 12th of the pain, and so on. Typically, as well, a lot of subscription revenues renew towards the end of the year. Okay, so they're not feeling the pain now. They're still, they're still working on the basis that their renewals are going to come in. And the reality is, I suspect if you're buying research at the moment, you're probably having conversations about, what's going to happen in this period, knowing that your budgets are going down. And the reality is that, you know, come Q4, and particularly in December, there's going to be a crisis with the research firms, which is why, as a research buyer, now is a great time to be making that choice to put investment into the firms that you trust. The other thing is that they will be producing weaker content potentially. Okay, so they've had all this disruption themselves. They themselves have had to push their staff into remote working. They've had to run around and deal with COVID-19. They will have had their own, you know, their own issues to deal with. And the flip side of that is that that in some cases they'll be producing weaker content, less content or weaker content. And it's something to look out for. If you're expecting research firms to go through this year and do what they promised to do, they may not. I've talked about disruption, and I guess one of the big areas of disruption is we've all assumed that this transition to working from home is relatively seamless for analyst firms. You know, you can pick up a laptop, you can connect to the internet, join through a cloud-based service and kind of do your work. And for most firms, that's true. What isn't true is that it's easy to manage remote teams, particularly during a crisis, and expect the same productivity and quality out of them. And I would say that's a very obvious, to me, it's very obvious pain point that that remote teams and offshore teams potentially will have much harder challenges in terms of managing the quality and the productivity. Okay, so you know, if people aren't traveling to go and see their teams, if those teams have any kind of weak management, then you know that's all getting exposed by this, and that's true at the team level, and it's obviously true at the individual level. So that's a hidden pain point, right? And it's true for everyone that the weaker parts, the parts that need more management, aren't going to get that direct management, and they aren't going to get that direct oversight. And the firms that run those teams won't necessarily have the control and the management processes and the you know and the systems in place to make sure that people that work remotely deliver what they were doing before. So that's a hidden pain point. In summary, then, if we just take a couple of minutes just to draw all of this out, I would say that we're not, you know, the research firms are not through the crisis yet. They're still trying to work out what's what. I would say for the research buyers, now is an absolutely fantastic time to engage. You know, research directors within information companies thrive on quality interactions. Okay, they thrive on their clients really telling them what they want, and they thrive on the sectors that they cover, giving them first-hand insight. Now is a great time to innovate. Tell them what you want. Tell them what you're using the information for. Tell them what innovations you want to see. Tell them, you know, that they can rest assured and have your renewal in later on in the year if that's something that you're thinking. It goes without saying that this is a buyer's market. Okay, so if you want to negotiate, lay down the groundwork for that now. Okay, go out and find out from your users, you know, what they're really using and so on. Know that the information companies will not all survive in the same shape that they were before this because of this constriction in revenues. Okay, for the ones that are picking up discretionary spend, for the ones that have perhaps produced slightly flabby research around the edges, they're not going to be able to survive in the way that they were. So, you know, you as the buyer, as the information buyer, have a lot of power. And finally, I would say, you know, test for some of the things that we've seen come through in this presentation. Okay, the information companies aren't going to stand there and tell you the way that they're going to be affected and what it means for you, but you don't have this level of disruption, and you don't have this level of energy being put into a research topic, and you don't have this constriction in spend without having fairly substantial consequences. So, you know, just be aware that there will be changes behind the scenes that you may not be told about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben, for that great talk. Whilst you've been busy talking away, the audience have been busy listening away, and they've got some questions to put to you. I guess one great question we got from earlier on is, how do you verify data given the speed that everything's moving at the moment?
It's a good question, and it depends what the data is. I think earlier in the talk I said ask people to show their workings, and you know, a good firm should be able to talk you through its methodology. It should know that you're probably not going to go and take that methodology and try and do it yourself. I don't think you can always verify data, but you can verify methodology, and you can ask where information is coming from, and know as well that you know that some of this information, and particularly a lot of the forecasts, won't be that easy to verify. You know, that a lot of what's pouring out in initial stages is more anecdotal than quantitative. Where we are getting quantitative data out, you know, I think you have every right to say, you know, what is the sample size, where is this coming from, and so on. I know in our cases, you know, for example, we talk to distributors in Africa, and we're very clear that a lot of what we're talking about is anecdotal. We've heard something, this is what it is. You know, we don't put that in quantitative terms. I would say if you want to verify the data, verify the methodology.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Another question here really is, during this period of perpetual uncertainty and ambiguity, how have the questions you've been posed by clients changed, given how hard it is to kind of what we call nowcast?
Well, in our case, we've kind of been lucky in that we cover Africa, so Africa's often very unstable anyway, and people don't require us to give very hard and fast forecasts. They ask us to give hard and fast recommendations, which is a different thing, and how to cope with the uncertainty. I think I think the key here really is to not take forecasts as given, because they're not going to be in this early stage. You know, some pieces of information that are coming out are pretty solid. We know that, you know, nobody sold any cars in the country, for example, and we know that people aren't taking holidays and all of those sorts of things. But realistically, a lot of the data is still very young at the moment and isn't being isn't really coming out in a long way. I would say, you know, when it comes to data at the moment, just understand that it's going to come out with a bit of ambiguity, and you know, probably the better sources at the moment are that example of the Gartner example, where you know, people have taken the pulse of things. You know, you've got a lot better sense of what's going on in industry by talking to a handful of CFOs than you do waiting for the ONS data to come out and reveal what's happened in the industrial sector. And I think you know, we've got LinkedIn here. You know, everyone's got their own networks. If you don't have to go to the research firms necessarily to hear this, you also have your own data sources. The key point I would say is, you know, just expect data to be a bit wobbly for the next few months.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. In terms of like research firms, do you have any kind of recommendations on getting them to listen to you and collaborate?
Okay, so listening and collaborating are two different things, and as a sort of research director, I love the idea of listening, and my heart sinks a little bit when I hear collaboration, because it always makes me wonder what a collaboration looks for. But look, we talk the language of collaboration. I think it's very easy. You can go to your account manager and you can say, look, I just want to talk to the guy that leads the research program here, and I want to have an hour with him and talk to him or her. And and have that conversation. So that's fairly easy. I don't think any account manager of a decent account would ever say no to that, and I think it's very valuable and refreshing. And you will find that it's that you'll get a lot of insights that can't be committed to paper quickly. So that's, you know, just from a research perspective, it's a useful thing. From a client engagement thing, it's fantastic. In terms of collaboration, I would suggest being clear what that means, because it can mean an awful lot of different things. And if you mean sharing of information and getting information back, that's great. If you mean starting a whole new project for something in the middle of a crisis, I would suggest that's probably something that's a little bit hard to do. You know, earlier in the presentation, I talked about the challenge for research directors, that you get a whole wodge of information back where people, you know, are very wedded to certain things that you do and other people don't want things, and you've got this huge plurality in terms of client voices, and often the loudest ones are the ones that people listen to. So I guess maybe the advice would be, you know, think very carefully about the messages that you want to give, and if you can amplify those through your peers, then it will have more success. I cannot stress more that for most research directors, the quality of feedback that they get from clients is not that great, and it's not really anyone's fault. It's just that, you know, it's a bit of a luxury often to sit down and do a systematic process. About 5-6 years ago, I did some work for a research firm who had great customer intimacy. Their customers absolutely adored them, you know, loved them, renewed, thought they were amazing. And I spoke to probably 10 of their core clients, and every single one of them said to me, "We love what they do, we love this, we love that, you know, everything." And I could have gone back to this consulting company and said, "Look, you know, they love you don't need to change anything." But underneath all of that, every single client said to me, you know, as an aside, they said, "But you know what? If someone cheaper came along, we'd switch in a heartbeat. We think they're very overpriced." And that was the key point that the company really needed to know. You're not justifying your price properly. And so, you know, if you're going and talking to research firms, you know, don't say the loud bit quiet. Say the thing that you want to say directly. If you think they're not worth the money, find a polite way to tell them that. If you think they take too long to get information to you, tell them that. If you think that they should be conducting themselves in a different way, tell them that. Now is the time to force that innovation. People have real permission to innovate, and it's a fabulous time to give feedback.
Okay. And another point here, really slightly less optimistic, actually. People are inquiring about doing due diligence on their provider before renewing. And what kind of reassurance do you think people get in terms of knowing their provider is going to be around in, say, 3 months' time? Any kind of recommendations there?
Wow. Yes. So I would say there are 2 bits of due diligence to do. So the first one is, are they going to be here? And the second one is, are they actually going to do the thing that I want them to do? In other words, are they just going to take my money and then not deliver the thing there? I'm not sure you can do a huge amount of due diligence right now about their financial status. I mean, you can go and look at Companies House. If they're big enough, you can look at, you know, a little bit more detailed information in terms of what they are. Again, I would say probably the best piece of information that you could get is to talk to your peers and ask them what percentage chance, you know, they have for renewing with a particular provider. Even 2 or 3 is enough, because if that number is starting to dip or not very high, you know, and you think that that's something that's going to be going on across you know, their client base, you've got a company that's got problems. You know, take it as read that for the rest of 2020, that new business for these firms is going to be very hard to come by. Renewal business, you know, if it's locked into the budget, you know, it may or may not happen, but new business, it's going to be hard. So the 2 bits of due diligence are not just, are they going to survive, but are they going to deliver the thing that I expect them to be delivering? And I would say you know, the key to that probably lies in the quality of their renewal base, broadly speaking. I don't think it's just that companies will fold. I think it's just that companies may take your money and just deliver, you know, rubbish because they don't really have the budget.
Yeah, sure. And do you think there's an opportunity for cost reduction? And you talked about, like, perhaps, you know, people spending less money on research. Is there an opportunity with remote working for kind of cost to be taken out of the business?
For research firms,
yeah,
yes. I mean, there are, in the sense that, you know, if you're paying 30 or 40 or 50 pounds a square foot for an office somewhere, you know, and you don't need all of that office, but the reality is that firms have largely committed to their leases. So, you know, the cost savings that they can make, they can't make in a short term. I am sure that they will be forced to make cost savings, and they will be forced to find new and innovative ways to work. And, you know, the revelation here is really that analyst firms, when a lot of people offshored to places like India, they just shifted the work out there, and they just had a cheaper group of people turning the handle to generate information. And we've seen a huge explosion in the information industry of just stuff. And I'm not sure all of it's been that valuable. So when the cost savings are forced upon the firms, I think what it will force is it will force a different way of working. So they will get rid of headcount, and they will get rid of perhaps certain types of headcount and bring in other types. And in amongst all of this, the ability to collect data, analyze data, and push data out has become much cheaper and much easier, but it requires a different skill set. I think probably 3 months ago, I went to the British Library and I went and looked at a whole bunch of information providers to see what they were doing, knowing that I run a small firm and we don't have the budget to do exciting things. And I thought, what are the big guys doing? And if I'm honest, I was pretty horrified that most of them were still churning out stuff in kind of the way that they were doing 10 years ago. And it wasn't very exciting, and it wasn't very innovative, and it was very labor intensive. And so I think they would probably tell you they can't make cost savings, but look, they can make cost savings because they can work in a different way, okay? And they can focus more on higher value research, and frankly, they can stop trying to compete on volume. It requires a bit of discipline from customers as well to stop asking the volume question. Okay, so if your account manager is there talking about, you know, volumes of this and volumes of that, and it's making you go cross-eyed, steer the question to value, you know, because it's been a volume-driven game for quite a while.
Okay. Right, that makes a lot of sense, Ben. So time is nearly up, and thank you so much for an insightful presentation and for taking the time to answer those questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the Padlet live for this evening, and then if people want to add some more points and questions on, and I'll share that with you, Ben, if there's anything of interest there to you. You can respond to people if that's okay. So
no problem at all, and people can contact me through LinkedIn. You know,
yes,
please do follow up if you've got questions. I'd be thrilled to answer them.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we're going to share these slides on the website next week, so that the whole webinar will be available for all, together with your contact details there, Ben. So before we go, I just want to highlight our next webinar, which is on the 1st of July. Hal Kirkwood, SLA's immediate past president and the Bodleian business librarian, is going to be providing an introduction to mind mapping. That's the technique which enables the visualization of ideas. So thank you everyone who's joined us tonight and for all your questions. And we hope you'll be able to join us again on the 1st of July. Stay safe. Thank you.